I keep getting the same comment over and over. But should the beginner furniture maker really buy a track saw before a table saw? As you can see, I'm halfway through building two identical side tables, one with a track saw and one with a table saw. And I already know which one was significantly more painful to build. And I've been using both tools for years, so let's take it from the start and find out. I'm gonna jump straight into the biggest non-starter for the track saw, and that's gonna be ripping boards to width, which is something that you're gonna be doing in practically every woodworking project. Now, the problem with using a track saw to rip narrow boards like this is that not only is it a huge pain, which you'll see in a minute, not only will you have trouble getting two boards to be the exact same width, but you'll also struggle to prevent tapering the board. You need to have parallel guides to maintain consistent width on a single board and repeatable results across many boards. And these are pretty wildly expensive for what they are, and even with them, the process is slow. I have to clamp down every board in a fashion that's not gonna get in the way of the track saw's path on top of a scrap piece so I don't destroy my bench top. I'm gonna clamp it down using these little specialized bench dog clamps that I can do it from end to end. Seems reasonable. Now I can go ahead and put my track with the parallel guide set on top of it. Nope, I can't because it tips right off, so hopefully you have a board of the same thickness around and I can use that to support it, or not. I think I need another one. Does that work? I think so. Now I should be good to go. Nope, not good to go. I need to probably double side tape this track down because I can't use track clamps on the track in the way that this is set up. So all that just to stick it down with some double-sided tape. This is what you call cliffs of insanity. Now for that one rip cut, that took me nearly 2 minutes to set all this up, and then I have to do most of that all over again for the next board. Now let's do the same thing on the table saw. I set my fence to the width I want. Done, 10 seconds, and I can repeat the exact same width cut for as many boards as I want without measuring again. And if I need a different width, I can just move the fence once and I'm good to go. But wait, it gets worse. The real kicker here is that these fancy parallel guides cost as much as an entire entry-level job site table saw. You could buy a whole functioning saw for what they want you to pay for a couple pieces of aluminum and some clamps. It's laughable. If your morals allow it, you can buy imported knockoffs of these parallel guides for cheaper, or you can DIY some out of some scrap wood, but accuracy might become a complete gamble with that. I promise this whole video isn't just gonna be me completely dumping on the track saw the whole time. I actually have several good reasons why I really like track saws, and I'll explain later that if I were to quit YouTube right now, I might completely ditch my table saw altogether. But there's still big deterrents for me recommending a track saw before a table saw for the beginner furniture maker. Now here's where Drew Witt gets really mad at me. My second biggest gripe with the track saw, you can't do any joinery with it. I mean, I'm sure there are ways that you can jig up the track and then make a bunch of repeated kerf cuts by nudging the track over a little bit at a time, but just like, no. The people who recommend a track saw before a table saw forget that most users invest in some sort of additional joinery system like the Festool Domino, which is great, don't get me wrong, but now we're talking about buying a track saw and a $1,000 joinery tool just to get started. And remember, we're asking which tool a beginner should buy first. You can create some good joinery using a decent plunge router. And yes, my plunge router does work now since I replaced the cable after running it over in the last video. It's fine. Ideally, you'd have a decent router table for expanded joinery options. However, a decent router table will definitely rival the cost of a table saw. For our track saw end table, does an angled mortise and tenon with a plunge router make sense for the beginner? No. How about a $1,000 domino? No. Glue and screws? Yeah, maybe, but I am not in love with that idea. but I think a dowel jig makes the most sense. You can see how this is definitely a limitation, and it affects how you design your furniture. And nothing's as beginner friendly like being forced to buy 3 more power tools just to connect 2 pieces of wood together, because for the table saw version of the end table, I'm using the table saw itself to make joinery and not some other tool, and I'm using it to make some half laps to join the braces to the legs. Incredibly straightforward. Table saws are also capable of cutting a whole variety of joinery that makes your furniture not only stronger but also better looking than just peppering dominoes around every workpiece. That's exactly why I created the Joint Academy, a complete video encyclopedia that shows you how to cut 12 essential joints using the tools that you already have in your shop. I cover each joint with multiple methods across 7.5 hours of unfiltered instruction, so you'll know exactly how to tackle any situation your projects throw at you. The course is on an introductory sale now for 40% off from now until Labor Day, and if you're not quite ready to jump in, I have a free ebook on joinery strength and selection that'll help you choose the right joint for any project. Okay, at least the track saw should be decent enough at cross-cutting boards to length, right? The track saw only really wins at cross-cutting long boards that are too long for your table saw, and honestly that only really makes sense if you don't already own a miter saw. And one of these would handle long boards way better than all the setup time needed for a track saw. And as much as I stamp my feet and shout in other videos, beginners still tend to buy miter saws before either a table saw or a track saw anyways. You'd ideally use some sort of square with the track to nail a 90-degree cut, but even then you can't guarantee repeatability. For consistent repeated cuts, you'd either need a square with a long stop on it, like the very expensive TSO version, or you would need to invest in some sort of multi-function table setup with a fence and a adjustable stop. And now we're talking about buying a whole other system just to do what a table saw does naturally. If you're not aware, the Festool Multifunction Table, or MFT, is a workbench that Festool designed with a specific layout of dog holes, and with it comes a host of accessories like a fancy mount for your track, a fence with a stop so you can make repeated crosscuts, plus a multitude of other accessories and techniques that make it a very flexible setup, all for the low, easy cost of $800? So then I said to myself, this can't be that hard to make. Look at that thing. So I designed the Festool MFT dog hole layout into my workbench. I bought a bunch of accessories to make it work like an MFT that costed me about $800, and then proceeded to never use it ever because most workpieces suitable for an MFT would also work just as easy on my table saw. For said table saw, I built this crosscut sled years ago, and it makes repeated cuts super fast and accurate because of this flip stop and a long stop extension for longer boards. Clearly, I'm just not sophisticated enough to appreciate spending $800 to do what this $50 sled does. This took me about 45 seconds for 4 pieces. The track saw took about a minute for 1. Edge jointing, or straightening an edge. And yes, I'm going out of sequence here because in a proper workflow, edge jointing actually comes before ripping it to width, which I already covered, but I just didn't want to talk about it until now, okay? Since standalone machine jointers cost a terrific amount of money, getting a straight edge on a board is something that most beginners struggle with. The track saw does a great job here because, well, the track is straight, and then you put the track down and you make your cut, and then your cut is straight. And then what do you know? You have a perfectly straight edge. On the table saw, you can't just use the rip fence to make a straight edge if the board isn't already straight. It just don't work like that. I need to use this straight line rip jig, which is pretty easy to make and easy to use, but you can't do any lengths beyond 4 feet with this thing. 4 feet? That's like 40 feet to me. Whoa! I'm Mini Scott, but you can call me Scoot. I'm Big Scott's tiny bodyguard, and he hired me to protect his personal information, but joke's on him. I don't know how to do that. So instead, I use Incogni, the service that removes your personal data from those creepy data broker websites that are selling your info without you even knowing about it. Scott was driving the other day when some discount Gandalf didn't like how we honked at him for blocking traffic. This guy rolls down his window on his rust bucket of a Silverado and takes a photo of Scott's license plate with a comically bright light attached to his boomer-sized phone case. We don't know what he was gonna do. Find out where we live and come a-knockin'? Scott hates awkward situations. They make him sweaty and uncomfortable. Jeez! But with people's search sites, that washed-up wizard LARPer could have looked up Scott's license plate and found his address and his phone number and probably what he had for breakfast, which is no big secret because, well, he eats the same damn thing every day. But he doesn't want anyone to know that. Oh, good God! That is terrifying. But it's also scary how much of our information is just out there free for the taking. That's where your tiny privacy bodyguard comes in. Incogni contacts over 230 data brokers and casts your personal data into the fires of Mount Doom, just like the real Gandalf would. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use code ScottWalsh at the link below to get 60% off an annual plan. Achoo! Oh, gross. The one thing that the track saw absolutely destroys a table saw at, well, sort of, is when it comes to breaking down sheet goods. Cutting down full sheets of plywood on a table saw is really cumbersome, even on a full-size cabinet saw like mine, which is why, counterintuitively, professional cabinet shops use 10-foot sliders if they're using a table saw anymore these days. For the home furniture maker, breaking down plywood on a table saw can be dangerous if you don't have proper support, and hard to keep tight against your fence since these big sheets are so unwieldy. To get by this, I typically just rough cut plywood parts down freehand with a circular saw, which makes them easier to handle on a table saw, which I can then get down to final dimension. It's not ideal, but it definitely works. And in the case of this very odd shaped part I'm making for these side tables, I can either use a multi-sled or an L fence. The track saw is a clear winner at cutting down full 4x8 sheets of plywood, and you can do it right on your floor with some of that foam insulation underneath, and the cuts are nice and straight without incident. And also, track saws are great at cutting odd angles in sheet goods like I'm about to do here, where on the table saw you'd have to jig up something like one of those multi-sleds to do it accurately. Unfortunately, if you want any semblance of repeatability for things like plywood cabinet parts, for instance, once again, you're still gonna need some additional accessories for your track saw, like the parallel guides that we discussed before, or a track square, or possibly an MFT table setup. And here's the thing, manufacturers don't advertise track saws as like plywood only saws. They're marketed for all woodworking, and the reality is that beginners typically don't tackle huge projects that require full sheets of plywood like built-in cabinetry as their first projects. Unless you're planning on skipping right past cornhole boards and going straight to custom cabinetry, which would definitely be a bold strategy. Let's talk about safety. And there's no question that a table saw can feel pretty intimidating. And yes, they are responsible for a lot of shop accidents. The track saw, with its blade mostly covered and its plunge action, can definitely feel safer to use, especially for beginners. Most table saw accidents happen when people get complacent and they remove safety features. But I don't think the fear factor of a potential accident should dissuade you from buying a table saw. When properly used with appropriate safety gear like push sticks and a riving knife, I think the table saw is quite safe. And yes, I know that's rich coming from me, as I'm not exactly the model citizen of table saw users, but to all those who tell me to put my riving knife back in my table saw, it doesn't have a riving knife, so go buy me a saw stop if you want me to have one. As for dust collection, both tools can be connected to a dust extractor or a shop vac or a dust collector in the case of the table saw. The track saw, because the blade has a nice enclosure to it, typically catches a little bit more sawdust than a table saw, which can be a little worse or a lot worse depending on what you're doing. However, the track saw, as you can see, is definitely nowhere near perfect. However, I think solely basing your decision on track saw versus table saw on dust collection is a little nuts, because there are other tools in your shop already, like a handheld router, that creates so much more dust than either of these tools. There is no such thing as a dust-free shop, so don't base your tool purchases on dust collection at all, for any tool for that matter. Space is a real consideration. A track saw can be stored on a shelf, and the track itself can be hung up on the wall, which takes up minimal space when not in use. A table saw like mine pretty much requires permanent floor space. Even a job site table saw needs a spot to live, although one of those folding work stands can stow it out of the way when not in use. The track saw's compact size is a significant advantage. However, I managed to stuff my full-size cabinet saw in my basement cellar old workshop that was 120 square feet, and I still had room for everything else. I screwed up. That dowel jig was not supposed to be used like that for a reason, and those dowels did not line up in that three-way miter. So I had to plug those dowels, and yes, I used the domino to make that joint, but it lines up now. Let's talk money, because tools ain't cheap. For a decent entry-level table saw, you'll be looking at about $300 to $600 that will get you a serviceable job site saw that will handle most beginner projects. If you want to upgrade to a contractor or a hybrid style table saw, you might be looking at about $800 to $1,200. And if you want to go big, like a cabinet saw like mine, you could be into the multiple thousands of dollars brand new, or you could be like me and buy a used one for pennies on the dollar. For track saws, an entry-level model starts at maybe around a couple of $100, but if you want a Festool or a similar high-quality brand, you're looking at $600 or $700 or $800, and then add another $150 or $200 for a track square, another $200 or $300 for parallel guides, and maybe you want another length of track that's longer than the one that comes with it, and potentially more for other accessories like track clamps or maybe a whole MFT table setup. I mean, at this point, you've probably spent enough to buy both a decent table saw and a miter saw, but hey, at least a track saw fits on a shelf. And remember, you're not making any joinery with a track saw, so you'll still need a decent plunge router and or a router table and or a doweling jig and or a Festool domino. The table saw comes ready to do a wider variety of tasks right out of the box. Plus, you can build jigs instead of buying accessories to expand its capabilities. Here's something that might surprise you about my own preference with the track saw versus table saw debate, given what I've said in this video so far. If I quit YouTube right now, I could likely get rid of my table saw and still be happy. Let me explain. I'd really like to be building statement pieces of furniture like the desk that I made last year. In that video, I posed a very simple question. What was it about this particular video clip that was so distinct? Nobody got the answer right. It was the only time that I used a table saw in the entire build, and that was just to rip down the desktop boards to width. All of the other straight cuts were done using a track saw because the parts of that desk were all so large and odd shape that the table saw just didn't really make a whole lot of sense. And again, these are the type of projects that I love to build. But that was a stark contrast to the projects that I used to make when I started woodworking as a beginner, and the table saw was way better for those simpler things that I was making. The point is that beginners ask advanced woodworkers what they should buy, and then the advanced folks tell them that a track saw is better, and well, because that fits their current advanced needs, but they forget that beginners aren't making the same type of projects. If you're primarily making smaller projects like end tables or boxes or shelves, the table saw definitely has the advantage. But I suppose if you're making large built-ins or huge complex furniture pieces, AKA likely not a beginner, the track saw definitely starts making more sense. I suppose that if you're doing job site work, then maybe a track saw makes more sense. I don't know, this is not a carpentry YouTube channel, it's about furniture making. We tend to prefer our workshops over job sites, mostly because job sites pose the risk of social interactions. Because of the repetitive setup for ripping and the lack of joinery options, the track saw table took me what I can guess around 30% longer overall to build. And I'm not gonna lie, about 100% more curse words were uttered. And this was mostly because of the constant setup and resetup times that the track saw added. But besides the obvious differences in the joinery, both tables look pretty much identical. Now, all this is to say that eventually a lot of woodworkers will graduate to owning both a track saw and a table saw. And just because you need to choose one right now doesn't mean that you won't be able to buy one later. Just make a few more noodle boards and sell them on Etsy to get you that track saw faster after you buy a table saw. If you're looking for a great first project, then check out my workbench build video. It's a super flexible, inexpensive project that's perfect for beginners and intermediate woodworkers alike.